Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished delegates, good afternoon. I declare open the 17th meeting of the second substantive session of the Preparatory Committee of the Durban Review Conference. You may recall that this morning, when the delegation of France asked a question about beginning item 2 in order to deal with the accreditation of one of the non-governmental organizations, and then we went back to drafting and negotiations, we said that at the beginning of the afternoon session we would start, and before going into any negotiations or drafting mode on Section 5, we said that we would open item 2 in order to take a decision regarding this NGO. The Secretariat has circulated a draft decision regarding this NGO. The Presidency has been informed that all concerned parties have agreed on this draft decision. Is there any request for this floor? Do I understand that the Preparatory Committee is ready to adopt the draft decision before you? This draft decision regards the NGO ABGLT. Is the Preparatory Committee ready to adopt this draft decision without a vote? It is so decided. Thank you for your cooperation, and I would like to thank all concerned parties for their cooperation, and I would also like to thank all those who have worked hard to facilitate negotiations between the concerned delegations. Thank you all for all your work. Now I see that the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran asks for the floor, followed by Egypt. First, the floor is to Iran.
Thank you, Madam President. With respect to granting the accreditation to the ABGLT, my delegation believed from the very outset that the area of activities of this NGO is unrelated to the subject matter of the Durban Review Conference. And the information provided further by that NGO further reinforced our basic presumption. And this position is consistent with our principal position that the issue of sexual orientation is outside the purview of Durban Review Conference and also DDPA. However, my delegation could join the consensus to grant the accreditation to this NGO based on the parameters agreed in the draft suggested by Brazil in a move to keep the unity of the conference at this sensitive stage of our work and a spirit of cooperation. Therefore, our agreement to this decision should not be understood in any manner as compromising our principal position. And in this spirit, I would like to ask that the reservation of my delegation be recorded in the proceedings of the Preparatory Committee. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Of course, sir, your position and reservation shall be recorded in the records of this meeting. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I make this explanation of vote after the vote on behalf of the African Group. The African Group believes that the notions on which the principal activities of the NGOs subject of our decision are premised are of no relevance to the Durban Review process. We decided not to request a vote in order to allow the nascent negotiating process to advance without wasting any more valuable time on responding to regrettable provocations, and on the basis that the NGO in question shall fully respect its obligation not to raise a single issue not mentioned in the DDPA. This shall be the subject of close monitoring. The African Group deeply regrets the loss of time and waste of effort in relation to this matter. It is imperative to focus on the immediate priority of successfully moving the process forward and to refrain from stalling or undermining it, whether in intention or effect, by bringing issues falling outside the purview of the Durban Review process and indeed human rights protection at large to the fore. It is our understanding that no similar distractions shall be pursued again in this PrepCom. It is well registered that paragraph 2 of the decision represents the first instance where the international community as a whole recognizes that the concepts advocated by the concerned NGO are not part of the DDPA and do not constitute human rights norms or standards. The African Group requests that this explanation of vote be reflected in the official records of the PrepCom. Thank you.
Shukran.
I thank the distinguished representative of Egypt who spoke on behalf of the African Group. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of France.
Thank you, Chairperson. The European Union welcomes the accreditation of ABGLT. However, we deplore that in a number of cases in the PrepCom had to engage in difficult conversations in order to accreditate NGOs rather than an automatic accreditation on recommendation of the Secretariat after having checked the conformity of the candidate with the applicable rules of procedure. It's equally regrettable that the objection raised relevance to the activities of the NGO. Well, we think that the relevance of the activities of the NGO, the ABGLT, are perfectly within the purview of the Durban process. Discrimination based on sexual orientation is one of the multiple and aggravated forms of discrimination which deserves treatment in the case of this review. It is, however, positive that an agreement was reached among a number of involved delegations, and the European Union interprets this decision to accreditate as full accreditation under ECOSOC rules, which do not establish other condition other than the procedural one established in Resolution 96/31, particularly in paragraph 7, and we will ensure that practice during the review conference confirms this understanding. The European Union will see to that. Thank you, and I hope that you will also record this explanation of vote in the records of the meeting. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of France, and of course your position shall be reflected in the records. I see that the distinguished representative of Nigeria has asked for the floor. You have the floor, sir.
Madam Chair, thank you very much. I think my delegation wants to reinforce the statement of the very distinguished representative of Egypt on behalf of the African Group and where we stand on this issue, to the effect that controversial concepts, no matter how interpreted, that do not belong to the DDPA should not at any time be constrained or be interpreted as a matter of elasticity to mean what they are not. Importantly, we have seen also that good use of quiet negotiations could make a lot of difference. Instead of each time bringing to the floor matters that had not gone through due consultations and in effect drag on and displace us from focusing on the content of what we are doing. While we take and go along with the decision that have been taken. It is important to note that we will not want issues of this nature that had not been in any way reflected in the DDPA to be introduced, because by the end of the day, you know that nobody will agree with it, or there won't be common agreement on it, and it will only delay us in our work. We thank the proposition QCG put together on our behalf that are very clear, which had been emphasized time and time again by our coordinator of South Africa. I thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of Nigeria. I do not see any other request for the floor. Indonesia, you have the floor.
I would like to thank you, Madam President, for letting me express the position of the delegation of Indonesia. And I've been following the issues of sexual orientation and on the draft decision, and we have a strong position for that. But for the sake of the consensus, we would share the position of Iran and Egypt. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Indonesia. I believe he was the last speaker on this matter. I do not see any other request for the floor at this stage. Therefore, this is what we wanted to deal with under item 2. And now I shall ask the distinguished representative of Sri Lanka and facilitator of section 5 of the outcome document. Therefore, I shall ask him to come to the podium to take his place. I would also like to declare that at 5 o'clock, we shall open the section for observers and NGOs to continue the list of speakers that were unable to take the floor yesterday because of time constraints, in addition to other NGOs. We have found that 45 minutes is not long enough. So from 5 till 6 is the time that will be allocated to the observers, including NGOs. And that in order to comment on what we have achieved so far. Therefore, I thank you all for your understanding and cooperation, and I thank you for adopting this draft decision by consensus. I wish you all success in the remaining time before moving on to the observers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam President. Excellencies, dear colleagues, we now resume our discussions on Section 5 of the outcome document of the Durban Review Conference. This morning we have concluded the first reading of the first part of the facilitator's paper. And now we move on to the second part of the facilitator's paper, which deals with, as you are all aware, the important and the core of this section, identification of further concrete measures and initiatives at all levels, and it goes on. We have identified this as a second part of this document. I intend to follow the same methodology that we have been following in the morning, from the morning. I briefed you how we were following the methodology, and the same way I intend to do so under this part as well. Having said that, I now would like to open the floor. National level, A, subheading A, national level. We have two topics, and we have many topics under this section, under this subheading, many subtitles. And I will deal with first two subtitles. One is legislative, judicial, regulatory, administrative, and other measures, and policies and practices. So that section, that subtopics, the paragraphs of those two topics starts from 16 to 39. So I open the floor for your comments and observations and discussion on these paras, 16 to 39. I open the floor now. Yeah, first speaker on my list is South Africa, distinguished representative of South Africa, please.
Thank you, Chairperson. Under the Item 2, identification of further concrete measures, A, national level, we have a comment on paragraph 16. We can support that unamended. I will now go to paragraph 35 and 36. The African group can support the two paragraphs related to national human rights programs, as well as compilation of targets and actions. Thank you. Now.
Representative of South Africa for that contribution. Now, next speaker on my list, Mexico, the distinguished representative of Mexico.
Gracias, señor facilitador. En la parte 2, relativa.
Thank you very much, Madam Facilitator. I do indeed thank you for giving me the floor. On this section, that is to say, the section that deals with the national level, I would like to make a few comments. Referring firstly to paragraph 20. Paragraph 20 calls upon states to produce data, and it says that data and indicators should be disaggregated by race and ethnicity. Now, I would agree that we do indeed need to have disaggregated data so that we can better focus public policies intended to prevent and to combat discrimination. Nonetheless, I do have an issue with this paragraph, and I come back to the term race. As my delegation sees it, this is a problematic term. We are here at a conference to combat racism, and as we see it, race is something which the very word implies that there are races, that there are superior and inferior races. So we actually believe that the very wording here runs counter to what we are trying to do, which is something totally different from that approach. And we have to be very careful, we would say, with our terminology. Now, we understand, of course, that the purpose behind this paragraph is to allow us to identify particular areas in which people are suffering from discrimination. We do understand the intent, but we have to be more careful with the wording. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Mexico. I see your point. I think these all paragraphs we have taken from your proposals and your suggestions. I hope the delegation or delegations who proposed this paragraph could react to your question or concern. I would appreciate, and then we could have a discussion on that maybe. I thank you for that. And then on my list, next speaker is the distinguished representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Facilitator. You have asked us to comment upon paragraph 16 to 39. Now, that's quite a lot of paragraphs to comment on all at one go. Nonetheless, I will go through these sections and highlight our comments on them. That's to say, firstly, the section on legislative, judicial, regulatory, administrative and other measures, and secondly, the section on policies and practices. Firstly, paragraph 16. I think there is a bit of a problem here with the language and possible legal implications that might arise, especially where we talk about taking measures in order to prevent and punish racism, particularly in public and private life. And this might be something that would actually be difficult to put into practice. We have to bear in mind the possible legal implications of this. Certainly, private life is something that is protected by clear legal provisions in many countries. So there might actually be a problem here legally, and I think we have to look again at the semantics in this paragraph, paragraph 16. On paragraph 17, again, I think the language could be improved in order to make it clear that this would refer only to contemporary forms of racism. We have a similar difficulty with paragraph 19. Here again, we're talking about preventing, investigating and bringing to trial and punishing any acts prompted by all forms of racism. Now, we understand, again, what the purpose of this is, what the intent is. But I think that if you look at judicial procedures, if you look at all this from a legal point of view, you have to bear in mind that this would actually require a case-by-case investigation, and we'd have to see in certain cases whether it was appropriate to apply certain penalties or not. So again, I think we have to look at the language here for legal, judicial reasons and to ensure that we really are being consistent with the purposes we're trying to achieve and with our laws and with our legal frameworks. In paragraph 20, our reiterated position, and that of the EU, is that, as was explained at length this morning, we cannot accept the idea of data being disaggregated by race. I think the arguments have already been put forward at considerable length and in detail on that point. I won't go over it again. Moving on then to the next section on policies and practices. Here we have a problem, especially with paragraph 25. We have a problem with the term affirmative action. I would urge that we find alternative wording here. We know what we're talking about, but we certainly cannot use these words. That's not acceptable to us. And the same point goes for paragraph 28. Again, there's an issue of language. On paragraph 29, we have the same problem. In paragraph 29, we find that the wording is really not appropriate, particularly when it refers to guaranteeing the benefits of development. We have some questions as to what is meant, and we think we do need to clarify the language in paragraph 29. So at present, we would have a reservation on that part of the paragraph. On paragraph 31, again, there's a problem with the way that this is restricted to intercultural relations. And here where it talks about intercultural relationships of officials responsible for upholding the law and developing public policies, we find that the language is not clear at all, and we think again there's a need to recraft this part of the paragraph. Paragraph 32 now. Again, there's a problem, a legal judicial problem, which really has to be looked at in general. The way in which we're referring to equality here is all very well and good, but we cannot talk about racial equality for the aforecited reasons. We do not believe that there are different races, and therefore this racial equality would be meaningless. Now, on paragraph 36, we think this paragraph should be strengthened. we should refer to the fact that we are indeed talking about different forms of discrimination of all kinds, and we do give a list here, but we think that an additional reference should be made that would be sexual orientation. 37, we also believe that we need to look again at this paragraph. It's too focused on different groups and should rather look at persons, at individuals. So we need to strike a different balance in that paragraph 37. We also have a reservation about the wording in 38, where it refers to multilateral cooperative programs. We know that in Chapter 2 there is some discussion of this, but it's actually an issue that relates to the whole negotiating process under the auspices of the DRC. And that's to say streamlining the follow-up mechanisms for Durban and looking at its funds and programs in that light. So if you bear that in mind, it would be rather difficult to commit ourselves to the wording we have here in paragraph 38, where we talk about the creation of multilateral cooperative programs. I think we'll have to come back to that at a later stage. And in 39, there's also a problem. In 39, we refer to the allocation of additional funds. Now, we already have this, in fact, in Chapter 1. And the EU cannot accept this paragraph. Undoubtedly, there will be more detailed comments to come, but at present, I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of France for that contribution. In the interest of time, I have suggested to take up all these paragraphs because we have dealt with I think 15 paragraphs in the morning. We took long time, so we have many paragraphs to deal with. So I took this liberty to divide into sections to deal with because we have very little time to go ahead, and then we are only given up to 5 o'clock to discuss on this text on these paragraphs, so we need to move forward quickly as possible. I thank you for that, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ethiopia.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to start first by endorsing the statement made by South Africa on behalf of the African Group. And I would like to react to one of the issues that was highlighted by France on behalf of the EU, especially in paragraph 16, that refers to private life. And of course, we may have difficulty in terms of how the issue of private life would fit into this, but the private arena or private sector, the role of private sector in implementing the DDPA is very relevant, and there are so many provisions dealing with the private sector. So we think that's very critical, and we should have a broader perspective of that phrase. So maybe we can work out on the language, but the role of the private sector and its responsibility is quite relevant. We also suggest that paragraph 16 and 19 be merged because they are more or less the same. Paragraph 20 generated some discussion, especially in relation to the issue of race. But we also want to take an issue with the phrase ethnicity. In fact, I come from a country that constitutionally recognizes ethnicity as a means of self-identification. So I don't have any problem with ethnicity, but we need to see how it fits into the DDPA because there is only one reference to it in the declaration and the plan of action that is. And so we are not sure how information will be, this information on disaggregated data would be relevant to the implementation of this outcome document. What we are seeing is probably what's intended here is data on incidents of violations, because paragraph 73 on plan of action talks about data on incidents of violations of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and other forms of intolerance. So maybe that's what we should refer to and adopt that language from that document. We have also a bit of difficulty with paragraph 21. The first sentence express concern about delay of report. But what we're requiring from states is compliance on the convention. I think that's too general. What's intended is probably asking states in particularly to submit reports on time. So we suggest the inclusion of the following language in paragraph 21 after recommendations, particularly by submitting reports, because we are talking about concrete actions or measures. Paragraph 22 deals with a very popular subject here in Geneva because it's about the universal periodic review, but we don't understand really how guidelines on the UPR should come as a part of the declaration. And of course, the document that we negotiated here in Geneva is very clear that the UPR will be exercised based on international human rights treaties. But I don't think the outcome document should talk about guidelines in terms of what kind of information, because this is clearly, it's an emerging process. We are at the learning stage in the UPR, and I don't think it's a business of this important declaration to talk about the detailed nature of the UPR exercise. So we suggest the deletion of paragraph 22. We don't understand why France, on behalf of the EU, found it very difficult to understand the benefit of development phrase in paragraph 29, because we have so many provisions, both in the declaration and the plan of action dealing with development, right? So development, issues of benefit, how development should be used as a method of instrument of implementing the DPP and equality, and, so I think it means what it says, benefits, and making sure that, people, minorities, indigenous people, migrants, and all benefit from development. And I think it's a non-controversial issue. So we think that's very useful to be included in that document. We also suggest that paragraphs 31 and 35 dealing with the more or less same issue be merged. This also applies to paragraphs 32 and 34, which talks about racial and gender equality to be merged into one paragraph. I thank you.
Ethiopia for that contribution. Now I would read the list of speakers on the order so that you will better informed of the flow, that time you are taking. Singapore, Bangladesh, Egypt, Botswana, India, and Switzerland. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Singapore.
Thank you, Mr. Facilitator. We're rather brief. Just have some comments with regards, like the delegation of Mexico had some queries about para 20. I think it could be further clarified, because I think some of the concepts there are not quite clear as it stands right now. Also, we can go along with what has been proposed by Ethiopia with regards to para 16 and 19 to streamline the text. We also share the concern expressed by France on behalf of the EU with regards to para 25, 28, and 29 with respect to affirmative action. We note that earlier the delegation of South Africa had indicated its willingness to work with us, and we will stand ready to work with the delegation to reach some sort of a compromise language in that respect. Thank you very much, Mr. Facilitator.
I thank the distinguished representative of Singapore for that contribution. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bangladesh.
Thank you, Mr. Facilitator. I also share the same views as our colleague from EU, France, has raised, that there's too many paragraphs to comment on at a time, but I understand, and I understand the time constraint under which you have been working, so we would go along with your proposal. We also listened to the comments on para 16, particularly in public and private life. I think we can work on that, and maybe if we can stop after intolerance, that will solve the concerns of our EU colleagues. But before that, I would like to say that this chapter on legislation, judiciary, regulation, administrative, and other measures, it should first start with the core issues of the conference. Then gradually it should build up and then take up these contemporary reforms. So I think some sort of reordering will be required at a later stage. And also I can also support the proposal to merge 16 and 19 together, because these are also saying the same thing, and we also need to work on para 17 as well. Para 21 should go to the previous chapter, as we have discussed also this morning. It should go under this international instruments and ratifications and all that, and specifically under the chapter reporting. This is unnecessary here. Para 22, 27 and many other paras, we see a continued attempt to build upon discrimination. My concern is we are not handling the entire issue of discrimination under this conference. And from time to time, I remind this august body that it is necessary to remind ourselves that we are talking about racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. We are not capturing every bit of discrimination, every human rights issues in this text. So wherever there is discrimination in the following paras, I would suggest that we add racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. I thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that contribution. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt.
Thank you, Facilitator. Let me begin by aligning my delegation with the comments made by South Africa on behalf of the African Group, but also with our colleague from Bangladesh, wholeheartedly, his last comment on the question of discrimination versus racial discrimination. It has been a source of frustration throughout this process, because if we can't even agree on the general parameters of the review exercise, or even fail to recognize what the DDP is all about, I think we'll be in trouble. Couple that with some legitimate concerns raised as to the accentuation of the notion of race, but on the other hand also its complete dilution or exclusion. If you keep talking about discrimination apart from racial discrimination, and then on the other hand dilute completely the notion of race as such, I don't know where this is leading to. But we just want to strike a note of caution. Facilitators, I agree with France and Bangladesh and everyone else. You've asked us to comment on too much at once. But let me just say that paragraphs 23 and 24 are very general in nature, and the document the program of action can easily live without them, regardless of content, of actual content. We fully support paragraph 25. We request the deletion of the reference to sexual orientation in 26. The inclusion of the term racial in 27 before discrimination. Fully support 28, fully support 29. And then, and also 31. Now, there seems, I think, to be some form of typing mistake. Perhaps a colleague would have alluded to this earlier. Paragraph 30 is exactly 32, if I'm not mistaken. So, excuse me, no, 33. 30 is 33. And 32 is 34. So we need to do away with a couple of those. And then, excuse me, on paragraph 16, I had forgotten to raise the issue of racism in private life. Of course, I'm sure that the term private life is quite problematic, and we express the same concern as France and others in this regard. But there is, however, a term which we traditionally use, the private sphere. You can either use institutional racism, or you can use racism in the private sphere. That's the very familiar term that we always use. And then on paragraph 36, we're quite happy with this language, except that it's a mere reiteration of the common article to both covenants. And this is a program of action which should be focused and action-oriented. So that's a general principle. But otherwise, we don't see any added value in having 36. It's a mere repetition. We would support 38 provided that we clarify what are the good practices mentioned in part 3 in the first line. We're not sure what this is referring to. And then on paragraph 39 we would request its deletion because basically I feel that it belongs more in the development discourse rather than in an anti-racism discourse. Anyways, it speaks to anti-discrimination policies. Doesn't speak to the question of racial discrimination as such, and then it speaks to international cooperation and technical assistance. In the area of racism, it is not always clear who needs technical assistance and cooperation from who, unlike development. And I would request the deletion of paragraph 39. But just to go back to a more objective perspective on this question of race, I do believe that we have 2 experts from the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, if I'm not mistaken. And as we always do, resort to resource persons whenever we're lacking clarity. Would it be possible at the beginning of the observers section to hear what the CERD has to tell us about this idea of race, which is very much the focus of the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and so on. And at the same time, I do agree with those who say that we should not accentuate the existence or promote the idea that there are different races and they're all different and they must be perceived as such. This is also wrong, but only in fear of exaggerating and diluting the acceptance of the idea of racial discrimination and also racial equality. International human rights literature is replete with instances where we refer to racial equality. In fact, you have ministries for racial equality in many countries. So I don't necessarily understand what's so detrimental about the notion of achieving racial equality. After all, I think we're working on a racial equality index. But let me stop there and hear from the experts of CERD what they would have to tell us on this subject. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Egypt for those comments. Yes, there is an error. I think it's paragraph 30 and 33 are the same, so we'll delete one. With regard to your request for to give the floor to the distinguished expert to the CERD, I think they will be anyway speaking under the observer, segment. So we'll give them the floor without sort of breaking their procedure. So I'll give the floor next on my on the list is Botswana, the distinguished representative of Botswana. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Facilitator. First of all, I align myself to the statement made by South Africa on behalf of the African group. My delegation would specifically comment on the subheading on policies and practices, precisely on paragraph 26. We wish to place on the record our reservation for the reference that is being made to the issue of sexual orientation. Needless to say, Mr. Facilitator, that our objections to this issue hinge on a dearth of universal consensus on this issue, that is sexual orientation, as well as the fact that sexual orientation has no place in the DDPA. Hence, it remains an unnecessary distraction which this negotiation or exercise can ill afford. We may wish to come back on other issues, Mr. Facilitator, if we find it necessary. Otherwise, we should be comfortable with the other paragraphs. Thank you.
Of Botswana, I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of India.
Thank you, Chair. Well, we have only some preliminary comments to offer at this stage. In fact, I was wondering in what manner this should be drafted, because it should be identification of further concrete measures and not a reproduction of what is already there in the DDPA. And therefore, we have to be very careful in drafting these paragraphs. If there is something on which DDPA has already pronounced, then that must also be, the wording should reflect that, and accordingly a follow-up should be suggested here. And therefore, we think that many of the things which have been proposed here, while of course are unexceptionable, maybe have been covered in DDPA, and therefore we will have to study it more carefully so that these are additional or further concrete measures and not merely a reproduction of DDPA. And if there is a particular measure which was identified in DDPA and needs to be reiterated, then it should be stated so. We can renew our call, we can reiterate, but it must be presented in that manner. I do share the comments made by Bangladesh and others that we must begin first and foremost by all forms of racism and then move on to contemporary forms. We notice that para 16 and para 19 only seek to suggest measures to address contemporary forms of racism, and I think the scope needs to be expanded. And para 16 and 19, of course, can be merged, as has already been suggested by other speakers. Second, there are several paragraphs already again pointed out by Bangladesh which deal with the issue of discrimination in general, and those either should be removed or made more specific to address racism. On 21, again, maybe it should find a place in the section dealing with CERD. We also have difficulty with the last part of the paragraph, which suggests that there are legal obligations arising from the committee's recommendations. The committee's recommendations are only recommendations, and the legal obligations arise only under the convention. So the last part of this paragraph should be removed. I think most of the other issues have been already addressed by previous speakers, so I won't repeat them. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of India for that contribution. Now, the next speaker on my list is the distinguished representative of Switzerland. You have the floor, ma'am.
And thank you, Facilitator. I'd like to begin by commending you on the significant progress that we are now making under your able guidance. As has already been stated by previous speakers, we think that it is essential that we make a particular effort to merge some of the paragraphs in these sections, especially the first few paragraphs, 16, 17 and 19, we think could usefully be merged, because it seems to us that the current wording does include a certain amount of redundancy and they could very usefully be combined. We would just like to clarify one further point, however. In principle, we do have a reservation on the reference to either private life or private sphere in paragraph 16. Whichever wording is used, we have a reservation on it. As for paragraph 20, as my delegation sees it, it is important that we improve the collection of statistics. Nonetheless, the current wording is not appropriate, and here we would support arguments adduced by other delegations such as Mexico, France or Belgium this morning. The wording used here, where it refers to data disaggregated by race, does indeed run the risk of giving the wrong impression, of giving the impression that the international community is actually advocating that concept, the concept of race as such. And we would prefer to refer to what we have in the DDPA in seeking to find some consensus wording on this point. As for paragraph 21, we wonder whether it is really appropriate to have the first part of this paragraph, because in fact this has already been referred to in chapter 3. It would appear to us then to be more suitable to keep only the second part of the paragraph, starting with the word strongly appeals to all states parties to the convention and so on, going up to under the convention. And here we would echo the comments made by India. We think that we could indeed, rather than stating to comply with the committee's recommendations, use the words to follow up on the committee's recommendations. We think that would be more appropriate. As for paragraph 22, We think this is also very important. We think the Universal Periodic Review is indeed an extremely important mechanism. It is essential that states take the opportunity provided by UPR to indicate to the international community what measures they have taken and what exactly they've done at national level in seeking to combat discrimination. Further, we believe that it's important to refer to Universal Periodic Review in D and E of this document also. As for national policies and that section, we're rather struck by paragraph 23, and we'd like to have some further clarification of that paragraph. What precisely is intended here when reference is made to the mechanisms that are supposed to identify, prevent and punish contemporary forms of racism? It's not entirely clear to us what is meant here, so we would like clarification of that. Then there are a number of paragraphs which refer to affirmative action, as has been already stated. Now, generally speaking, Switzerland advocates a policy of integration and of integrating non-nationals. We think that's important because we think that any other kind of action, that it would be to say affirmative action, might actually create new forms of discrimination. Now, of course, it's not that we are in principle opposed to such action, but we do think we have to think about the wording and ensure that we are fully in line with the DDPA throughout. As for paragraph 39, where there is a call for the allocation of additional funding, we have no objection to that in principle, but we would like it to be absolutely clear also in the evaluation section that funds have been made available to combat racism, and that has actually been the case since 2001. And Switzerland has given more than 15 million to support various projects in that area. My last point on this section. The delegations of Morocco and Switzerland will be proposing a paragraph that will deal with the issue of human rights education. We think that's a very important topic, and we think it should be included in this section. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Switzerland for those comments, and thank you for those encouraging words to the facilitator. I think with regard to your question related to 23, para 23, I think I hope the delegations or delegation who propose this para could reply or give some clarification on that for Switzerland. And also, I would like to inform you that you could submit that proposal on education. Then we could also include that in our draft, the next revised draft. So you could send that para to the facilitator. I would appreciate that. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Nigeria.
Mr. Facilitator, thank you very much, and thanks for the excellent job you are doing for us. My delegation supports the presentation by South Africa on behalf of the African Group, and endorse entirely what Egypt has contributed in this area, as well as Ethiopia. They reflected very wholesomely where we stand on these issues. I think there are one major argument that is coming more than 7 years late, and that is one, I'm saying this as a cover for all the paragraphs where racism appears. There is this argument about racism that racists do not exist, that before God we are all beautiful people. Very fine, but that was the original intent of God. But apparently it's not what is in reality. What is in reality is different. And if they're saying that with the opinion that we should be promoting racism, that is fine. But that we should deny the essence of race means that we should not even be talking about DDPA, because the very basis of DDPA is because they are racist and they are racism. That's the basis of DDPA. So to make that argument that is being made now is so many years behind. That's number one. Number two, I noticed that we are always talking about punishing contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination. I think before punishing the contemporary forms of racism, that we will always remember that there is racism before the contemporary form. So we will deal with racism as it is, then before talking about the contemporary form. So in effect, to reflect properly what is and not what had come after racism. As per specific paragraphs that we have here, South Africa has identified a number of paragraphs which we support. But outside that, difficulties have been appointed in other areas, particularly for system, which I've already said that racism, racial discrimination, and the rest of them should come as the basis before we enter into contemporary forms. I know that difficulties have been expressed on public and private life, but then racism is not limited to public. But the difficulty here is because we are talking about state and law enforcement that will make it difficult when you are talking about private life. But then the judiciary is based in dealing with issues of both public and private life. So in effect, it is not wrong, but the language that covers it, I think Egypt has provided when you talk about public and private domain, without just having to say private life. That may cover that very well. Then on para 20, emphasis was also laid on issue of ethnicity, and then issue of disaggregation. Really, the concept of aggregation, I suppose, may not have come out very well here. Maybe there needs to be a little clarification when you say disaggregated by race and ethnicity, whether it's limited only to the two, because the issue of ethnicity is something that belongs to a race. So when you equate ethnicity and racism, it does not come out very sharply, because racism is all-embracing. Ethnicity are the different units that are within a race, really. So as it is, it looks as if both racism and ethnicity are being seen as different things, and more or less the clarity does not come out very well. Again, if you go down to 23, it's still talking about contemporary forms. And then others had pointed out of the similarities between 16 and 19 that tend to be very factual. And if we go further all the way down to 33 and 30, which already express of being repeated. But what is even more important, really, if I may say here, is that we have so many paragraphs here that are supposed to be bringing out further concrete measures, which means that we already have concrete measures, if they are really concrete measures. And then what we are having now are things, additional measures, concrete measures. So as it is now, these are not additional concrete measures. These are declaratory measures of what we want to do. I don't see any of them as concrete, unless we have to frame the language to make them seem concrete, and also to streamline it so that it wouldn't be so many paragraphs that are really shouting so much but without things on concrete about them. But on the pattern of how you are going, Mr. Facilitator, I hope you will not mind those that said that you have so many paragraphs to go on. Whichever way you can go to make us speed up, please do. We'll support you. Thank you.
Thank the distinguished representative of Nigeria for those useful comments. Before I give the floor to the other speaker, I have a question now as a facilitator. Now, these all paragraphs were proposed by all delegations. And we have, as a facilitator, no authority to touch the language or delete or whatever it is. So it will remain as it is. So I take the point of India and in Nigeria. So if we are repeating the same language of DDPA, so we don't identify any further concrete measures or initiatives. So either the delegation could give the authority to the facilitator to use the language maybe proposed by India for those same language which has been already used in DDPA to use renew the call or renew or re-emphasize or something like that. So we could do so. And also the facilitator can identify those paras and then we could change the language. And also the delegations also can help us to when they are taking the floor to propose the language for those paragraphs. And also you can also inform us about the concrete measures, further concrete measures, and identify and inform us so then we can include or we can reflect accordingly. So the facilitator needs the help of the delegations on that issue because we cannot touch any language or any paras at this moment. If you give the authority to the facilitator to use the language, the renew, so we can recall or re-emphasize, so we could do so. So I need your guidance on that issue. Yes. Having said that, I give the floor to the delegation of Chile, distinguished representative of Chile. Yes.
Gracias, señor. Thank you, facilitator. On behalf of GRULAC, may I congratulate you on the way you're conducting our business. I'd like to touch on a few paragraphs of particular interest for our region. Paragraphs 21, 22. On 21, we think what Switzerland suggested is good. We'd be prepared to consider that. And paragraph 26, which is particularly important for our region, because it refers to measures required to extend protection against all discriminatory and intolerant practices, which means against any practice which might suggest expulsion or exclusion, etc., for reasons listed in this paragraph. So that's why we'd like to keep it. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Chile, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Colombia.
Muchas gracias, señor facilitador.
Thank you, facilitator. Our delegation would like to endorse what was said by Chile on behalf of GRULAC, that paragraphs 22 and 26 be kept as they are, and 21. And as regards paragraph 20, we would like to stress the importance we attach to variables in the public sector for the elaboration of public policy directed at avoiding and eliminating any form of discrimination. Now, we've heard some delegations that have misgivings about the drafting of this paragraph. We're happy to look at their wording, but we think it's important to keep the idea that's in the text. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Colombia, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Uganda.
Thank you, Mr. Facilitator. My my delegation aligns itself with the statement made by South Africa on behalf of the African Group. In respect of paragraph 16, my delegation would support the suggestion put forward by Egypt that we could change the language from private life to private sphere. And I believe that would also cater for discrimination in the private sector. In respect of paragraphs 25 and 28, where affirmative action is referred to, we would be interested in perhaps different form of language as was proposed yesterday, which is special and concrete measures, language borrowed from ISAD. In respect of paragraph 26, initially first of all, we take the view that sexual orientation is not something that we would find to be considered under the DDPA currently, and therefore should not be part of our discussion. Secondly, we have some difficulty with some of the other medical conditions referred to. For example, the fact of living with an infectious or contagious disease, genetic characteristic, mental condition, etc. We don't see how that would further the cause of racial discrimination unless the medical condition would be exacerbated somewhat by some racial discriminatory practice. But otherwise, on their own, it doesn't quite fit in with what we seek. And then we favor the retention of paragraph 39 as it is. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Uganda for that. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iran, Islamic Republic of Iran.
Thank you, Mr. Facilitator. With regard to paragraph 26, like some other delegations, we are of the view that the language used to refer to different grounds for discrimination in this paragraph should be based upon or in line with the language used in DDPA. Therefore, we would like to correct the references in this regard in this paragraph. Secondly, with regard to paragraphs 32 and 34, we are of the view that those two paragraphs should be merged together. And lastly, we wanted to share the view and the comments made by Bangladesh on the application of racism and racial discrimination to our work in the whole process of the Durban Review Conference. Thank you, Mr. Facilitator.
Thank the distinguished representative of Iran. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, Facilitator. I'll be brief because it's late. Just a few brief points. First of all, in this discussion that we've been having on distinctions among races and all being of the same human species, I, of course, agree that there are no differences among races, that we are all of the same species. But that can't be taken to illogical extremes as an excuse for saying, therefore, there's no racism and no discrimination. We've listened carefully to ideas such as perceived race, which has to be really analyzed. If we accept terms like that, then we'd be opening the door in the future to concepts like perceived discrimination, which would then deny the existence of discrimination. Just a comment. Now, on the paragraphs of this section, paragraph 21, now, of course, on this we agree with the content of the paragraph. The last part could be amended as proposed by India, but I don't think this paragraph really fits in this section. I think it's a paragraph that would find its place better in section 3 of the outcome document. Now, turning to paragraph 22. We agree with the essence, with the substance of the paragraph, but we have doubts as to the scope of the paragraph in a broader context for submission of information in the UPR, which is already agreed on in the Human Rights Council. It's an excellent initiative, I think, but it needs to be thought through in a broader perspective in view of the legal bases already agreed. We agree with what a number of delegations from Africa mainly have said relating to the word racial being included in all paragraphs that refer to discrimination in general terms. Of course, we're talking about racial discrimination here, and this has to be made quite clear. On paragraph 39, I agree here with what was said by the delegation of Egypt. I'd like to see same sort of enthusiasm for international cooperation, technical assistance in other fora, such as the working group on the right to development, where we always have problems in making headway with language of this kind. But it's not clear to me here who would be providing the technical assistance, who would be the beneficiary of international cooperation, and who would be in a position to provide it. Now, of course, Cuba would be very happy to help some, mainly Western countries, in promoting and protecting all human rights, particularly as we have experience in combating discrimination of all kinds. But I don't think this is the most appropriate paragraph for that, and we therefore would support its deletion. Thank you, sir.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cuba for that contribution. I would like to remind the delegations that we have only 5 more minutes or 7 more minutes to go. I have Belgium, Angola, Sweden, Pakistan, Japan, and Thailand. I would urge the delegations to be brief and to make their comments. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belgium.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Facilitator. France already set out in detail our comments on the paragraphs, so I'd just like to float some general ideas. First of all, I think that we're all quite clear that during this review conference we should concentrate on the issue of racism and racial discrimination. Far be it from us to want to shift the focus of the conference to something else. So in a number of paragraphs we certainly need to talk about combating racism and racial discrimination. But let me just remind you that in the DDPA there's also a reference to discrimination in general terms. A number of paragraphs, the principle of non-discrimination has been recalled. So I think we have to accept that discrimination in general terms also be addressed in certain paragraphs of our outcome document. And I think that paragraph 27, among others, is perfectly in line with what's already been accepted in Durban. Now, let's focus on racism and racial discrimination, but that doesn't mean we can't have some paragraphs which address discrimination in general. And very briefly, I'd just like to recall the fact that for us sexual orientation is obviously one of the issues to be taken up in the review conference. We don't have the same interpretations, but as far as we're concerned, the DDPA allows sexual orientation to be addressed, particularly in multiple and aggravated forms of discrimination. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Belgium, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Angola.
Thank you, Mr. Facilitator. My delegation supports the statement made by the delegation of South Africa on behalf of the African Group. I just want to share some thoughts concerning paragraph 20, which I consider to be perhaps the most important paragraph for the victims. That is something that we should be, that should be our focus, actually. Mr. Facilitator, we did not create the concept of race. Others create this concept, which became a problem that unfortunately we have to deal with. The importance of paragraph 20 is that will permit us to identify where we have problems and will help us to address it. Unless we don't want to address those problems. The paragraph, this concept of race, I full share the idea that we are all one race. That's, we have no problems concerning that. But as we are stressing this point, okay, it's like, for example, we have some people that can't find jobs because of their color, but that's not discrimination. That's not racial discrimination, because we are all from the same race. Do you believe on that? Finally, Mr. Facilitator, we will ask you to delete all the references to sexual orientation from the paragraph 26, because that's not part of the DDPA in our understanding. I thank you.
Representative of Angola for that contribution, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sweden. You have the floor, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your effective chairing this afternoon. My delegation fully aligns itself with the statement made by France on this section, but we would also like to make an additional comment on para 26 and the issue of sexual orientation. To my delegation, the concept of multiple and aggravated forms of discrimination, including discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation, is a very central issue to retain in this context. We believe that any attempt to eradicate discrimination must take as its starting point the individual and the realization that an individual is complex and often has several different identities and can be discriminated against on many different grounds. We think that any attempt to eradicate discrimination must therefore fight all sorts of discrimination to be effective. We therefore think that the DDPA provides the possibility to address the issue in this context. We also note that the purpose of this chapter is also to address challenges, and to my delegation, multiple and aggravated forms of discrimination is a serious challenge that remains and that is faced by millions of people around the world, and that we should address it in this context too. Thank you.
Thank the distinguished representative of Sweden. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to be, or I'll try to be at least as brief as possible. Quick comments. The issue of this public life should be replaced by public sector or public sphere in paragraph 16. The issue of sexual orientation, this delegation has similar views expressed by a number of delegations from African group. We must realize that while sex discrimination on the basis of sex is mentioned, it has nothing to do with sexual orientation. On the issue of discrimination in general, we do think that we are working under a specific framework. While it is, as mentioned by the distinguished colleague from Belgium, that it is mentioned about the discrimination in general, we understand that it is okay, but till the time it is like covered under the overall definition given in the paragraph 2 of the declaration. And in the same vein, we believe that paragraph 26 is kind of an omnibus para where we are trying to fix or put every issue that is of interest to different groups or different delegations. And such kind of approach is actually, in the view of this delegation, counterproductive to this exercise that we are undertaking right now. And instead of taking us forward would actually lead us to move into circles. So let's not get into this issue of definition. We understand well what is it covered under the paragraph 2, and we should start advancing our exercise of negotiation or exercise of taking this outcome document forward. Lastly, on the issue of the comment that you made that the authority of the facilitator, how much they can do and how much they cannot. In fact, this delegation had expressed its concern right when we were discussing the modalities as to what are we up to through this. And from the general understanding that we got, we thought that it was obviously clear that we are getting into some kind of simple reordering or a compilation exercise. We are not even sure whether these 5 facilitators are going to continue after tomorrow. So it's like a bit, we are in a bit strange kind of situation where things are a bit uncertain. But at the same time, we do understand that this is also an opportunity for the delegations to express their journal or initial or first comments on a number of issues which have been put forward by different delegations. So I think it stops there. But I think one has to be a bit more generative, like creating something out of which is obvious and understandable, like what we did in the part 1 or chapter 1. There were languages from different inputs given by different groups, which were not exactly the language which could have been put in these chapters as those were presented in those inputs. So there was some I would say, some work done on that language. And I think there shouldn't be any problem when we think that we are in the review process and a language does not correctly correspond to that process. We could always have a general understanding that it could be mentioned as re-emphasize or reiterate. These are the small words which I think even those delegations who have proposed this language would not object to. So I think this kind of initiative the facilitator should be able to take with the help of Secretariat, and I trust that the wisdom of those colleagues who have given this language, that they won't have any objection to that. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Pakistan for that. I inform you that this list is closed now for the speakers. I have 2 more speakers. Japan, distinguished representative of Japan. You have the floor, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Facilitator. First, I would like to commend you for your excellent chairing under this section. I'll be very brief. This is a preliminary comment, though the paragraph 29. I would like to thank the distinguished colleague of Ethiopia for the explanation. However, for the last sentences of this paragraph, it's still not clear to our delegation. Therefore, I'd like to reserve our position on the paragraph 29. Regarding paragraph 39, I would also like to reserve our position, or would like to join others in deleting this paragraph, as this paragraph has already been said in the chapter 1, as mentioned by the distinguished colleague from France. So I would also like to endorse this. Thank you.
Japan, I thank for your nice words. To the facilitator, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Thailand.
Thank you, Chair. Just very brief. We just have 3 comments. The first one is regarding the reference, the specific reference to include racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. So we would like to support the identification of such specific scope when referring to discrimination. Second point, regarding the phrase affirmative action. as earlier discussed, and has some reservation by some delegation, and also based on the proposal by New Zealand yesterday, that we could look into another phrase such as special and concrete measures. And I just found out that in the DDPA, they avoid to use this type of phrase, affirmative action, by using the phrase such as affirmative and positive measures. So maybe the delegation can look into the possibility to have this kind of wording, and you can refer to the paragraph 100 of the DDPA. The third point is regarding the paragraph 3.5. My delegation fully supports the inclusion of a program of human rights education, and we would like to join Swiss and Morocco in looking into the details of any proposal regarding to the human rights education. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Thailand for that contribution. I think we have exhausted our list of speakers. I see 2 name boards are still on, but I would inform you that there are 21 NGOs to speak, and I am told that there is no sort of meeting or debate tomorrow, and also we have the distinguished representative of CERD. Still those 2 delegations insist to take the floor. I think I will give you a very brief time if you could quickly, tell your comment and finish it. I thank you.
Thank you, Facilitator. Feel free to gavel at any moment. Facilitator, I take the floor on very general issues. First of all, the concept, the approach, because it will help us a lot. As Bangladesh said, it's racism and racial discrimination. 1 or 2 references to discrimination at large were justified, are fine, like Belgium said, but the focus is racial discrimination. Second, on sexual orientation, it doesn't exist in the UDHR, doesn't exist in the travaux préparatoires of the UDHR or the 2 covenants. There was never an intention to bring it in. When it was attempted in the Durban 2001 conference, it was agreed to leave it out. So all I'm saying is, as my colleague from the UK said, if it's broad enough so that delegations or countries want to imagine that it's there and take these issues in the context of national measures in this section in their own countries, we have no problem. But please don't impose it and don't make believe. Lastly, question of individuals versus groups. This is also very important because it was raised by friends today. Those most affected by racism, historically and until now, have been subjected to this type of discrimination because they are identified with common traits as groups. No one knew the names of the slaves they took and brought across the Atlantic some centuries ago before they took them, but they all knew who they were, what people they belonged to, and what color they were. Thank you.
I thank you for your comments, the distinguished representative of Egypt. I give the floor to Switzerland. If you could make quickly your comment, we'll appreciate.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Facilitateur, de me donner la parole.
Thank you for giving me the floor. I'll be focusing on this matter of race disaggregated data. This is not a theoretical issue. It's really a practical one. In Switzerland, we've taken measures to improve our statistics in accordance with the DDPA in order to regularly evaluate the position of individuals and groups of individuals who are victims of racism. But in Switzerland, we don't, on the other hand, have a legal definition of a race. So it's not possible to gather data following this modality. We can take data based on nationality, for example, but not on race, which doesn't exist as such in our legal system. There is no definition. And as it says in paragraph 92A of the DDPA, disaggregated statistics should be gathered in conformity with national legislation. So, to conclude, I'd just like to point out that you'd have to find some other wording, as far as we're concerned, for this disaggregated data. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Switzerland. I see the distinguished representative of UK. Please take just 1 minute. We have to give the floors to the observers. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Facilitator. I will take even less than 1 minute, given the time that we're at. Simply to respond to the comments made by Egypt, I'd like to underline my statement from this morning, which emphasised the importance of an inclusive process, not to the exclusion of any one group, including people of sexual orientation and suffering from multiple forms of discrimination. Thank you.
That half a minute could be taken by India. Yes, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. 10 seconds. Just to state for the record that affirmative action is a concept and term which finds explicit mention in the DDPA, and therefore the debate on this issue will continue. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of India. Let me sum up. Now, we have concluded the first reading of the second part of 2 topics, 2 subtitles. I think, based on your comments and recommendations and proposals, we will revise the text. So I don't know, I'm not in the position to tell you now, to inform you about our future work, how we are going to deal with other long paragraphs and long sections. So that, of course, the Secretariat will inform you the program of work. And I also wish to remind about a proposal, my request and a proposal from Pakistan, using the word, I mean, by facilitator, renew the call or re-emphasize or whatever it is. If the facilitator finds the same DDPA language is reflected in the text, do you give the authority or the liberty to the facilitator to use that word renew or recall or re-emphasize? If it is so, we could do so under this section. So then the rest will be further concrete measures or initiatives. So if it is agreed, the facilitator could take it. It will be used, it will be helpful to facilitate the facilitator's job. Only if it is mentioned in the DDPA, if we are repeating the same. I see no objections. I take it as agreed. Let me second. Now we are going to give the floor to the observers. So as I told you, I'm told that tomorrow we don't have the debate on this subject. And then I don't know how we are going to proceed with the other lot of paragraphs. And then the Secretariat will inform you about that. And having said that, I thank you all for your contribution and suggestions and recommendations. We will faithfully reflect your concerns at our revised document. And I don't know, without going through other topics or other paras, we would be able to circulate you the whole revised text. I'm in the hands of Secretariat how to deal with that. So with that, I thank you once again and see you again. I don't know the time limit. Thank you. So now we are going to give the floor to the observers. First in my list, the distinguished expert from CERD. You have the floor, sir.
Je vous remercie. Monsieur le Président, d'abord.
Thank you, Chairman. Firstly, on the issue of race. It is our view, and this is also the view of other members of the committee, that objectively speaking, races do not exist. race theory was something that came into being in the 19th century, and at that time reference was made to 3 races. I'm not going to name them now. But throughout the 19th century in Europe, people talked about the Latin race, the Slav race, and the Germanic race. That's how people in Europe were thinking in the 19th century about the issue of race. Now, as we understand it today, and in accordance with current thinking that is generally accepted, we developed a new approach in the 20th century, and we now consider that, objectively speaking, races do not exist. UNESCO studies, as well as studies undertaken by anthropologists, sociologists, and doctors, have proven that all human beings form part of the same race, a single race. They're all part of the same human group. And they are born, all of them, with the same intellectual capacity and capabilities. However, if we look at the behavior and the attitudes that are taken up by certain individuals and groups of people, distinctions are drawn between human beings on the basis of color, on the basis of physical features. And this is what leads to racial discrimination, to acts of discrimination, to discriminatory treatment. So race is an artificial concept. It's something that is sociologically constructed. Races as such do not exist. And in fact, if you read our convention carefully, you see that we actually define racial discrimination, not race, racial discrimination, as any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on race, color, origin, or national or ethnic group. In other words, what we're saying is that any distinction drawn on the basis of such concepts is considered to be racial discrimination. We are fighting racism, political racism, which is based on this kind of attitude, based on an attitude premised on the idea that there are races, although in fact races do not exist. We are therefore against racism. Now, of course, there is still discrimination on the basis of this conception of race in certain parts of the world and in certain countries. There are other forms of discrimination based on ethnic origin, based on cultural differences that exist among groups of human beings, on the basis of their descent or origin. And it is increasingly recognized that racism is becoming more cultural and less biological. It's now something that's based more on cultural differences. Attempts are made to draw up a hierarchy of cultures and to draw conclusions from that when we come to the way that people are treated in society. So that's what I wanted to say on that particular issue. Moving on to some other issues. On specific measures and on the issue of initiatives taken, we don't have a subsection on ethnic minorities. And I think that may mean that we lose a group. Now, obviously, we don't want to overload ourselves in this regard. I therefore share the view that when we talk about discrimination against women, children, discrimination against religions, discrimination against disabled people, we have to recognize that we're talking there about multiple forms of discrimination based on a number of factors, including race or ethnic origin. So we have to talk about multiple forms of discrimination. Otherwise, I think we are getting rather beyond the remit of this conference. As for the structure of this document, we understand that in the middle of the substance here, that's to say between chapters 1 and 2 and 4 and 5, we have chapter 3, which suddenly starts dealing with mechanisms, and that's not the best place. The mechanisms should come at the end. They shouldn't be in the middle of the document. On the matter of data, the distinguished representative of Switzerland gave a very good reply to what was said on this issue. And it's true that in paragraph 92 we do give a response to the questions that have been asked. You cannot ask for disaggregation on the basis of race, but you can ask for disaggregation on the basis of vulnerable groups. And we know what groups are vulnerable groups in the world in which we live today. We know that when you're talking about groups or individuals, then we are talking about groups and individuals that have to be protected against racial discrimination. That is certainly our view. And the Convention always refers to individuals and groups. And that has to be our starting point. We have to ensure respect for human rights. And that always has to be our starting point. Now, my colleague would like to add something to what I have just said. If you would allow me, I would now give the floor to Mr. Unsam. Thank you. I would like to say that I fully endorse the comments that have just been made by my colleague. I would, however, just like to add that when it is stated that there is a single human race, that doesn't mean that racism does not exist. Quite the contrary. It is, in fact, the attempt to create some kind of scientific distinction among people that actually means that we have to fight against racism. People do still use race as an excuse upon which they can build this philosophy of racism. So we have to bear in mind that although it is true that race does not correspond to anything in terms of objective facts, racism still exists. And what we therefore must do is to be ever stronger in seeking to fight against racism based on race.
I thank the distinguished representatives of CERD for those contributions. And now we move to the NGOs. First on my list, Migrants' Rights International, MRI. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I speak on behalf of a national Italian anti-racist committee that translated the full text of the Durban Declaration and Plan of Action. We are also part of the steering committee of Migrants' Rights International, that is an ECOSOC NGO, and we are actually interested to develop the follow-up of Durban in the sense of a better protection for minorities like Roma and Sinti and documented, undocumented migrants and also refugees. That's why we established in 2001 a caucus in Durban for the rights of migrants and refugees. That caucus never stopped its activities. It is still working and is waiting for more instructions for what to do for the Durban Review. Actually, there is no funding for the participation of civil society organizations and NGOs, and this is our first concern. In the year 2001, in the NGO forum parallel to the Durban conference, there were something like 15,000 different NGOs from all over the world. And this was possible because of the direct help from the European Union. But in this year, we cannot register the same interest. Also, on a national scale, we have not seen many progresses for the realization of the program of action of Durban in many nations. For example, in Europe, we never had a regional conference for the preparation of the Durban Review. And this is probably something that we could improve before April with the help of the French and of the Czech presidency of European Union. Rather than talking about the Italian situation, that's the country where I work actively, I would prefer to focus this intervention on the need of a bigger investment by governments about the participation of the civil society delegates and NGOs in the Durban Review. Because in our nation, in Italy, we have some problems with the Roma and Sinti integration that's not covered at all from the media. This is also the case of asylum seekers and many undocumented and documented migrants. Last of all, let me say that I have to speak about the Global Forum on Migration and Development that's having his next session in Manila next week. We will have a meeting with several migrants associations on what to do for the Durban Review. I thank you very much for the occasion to speak in front of the delegates. I hope that European Union will help the NGOs and civil society to be more actively involved in Durban's review. Thank you.
Distinguished representative of Migrants' Rights International. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Foundation for Aboriginal and Islander Research Action, FAIRA. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Facilitator. Mr. Facilitator, my comments I had prepared in relation to comments on Chapter 1. However, I hope that the delegates will appreciate that these are relevant to Chapters 1 to 5. I have some proposed text very briefly, which I'll read out, which should apply in relation to Indigenous peoples. Firstly, in relation to the sources of racism, and there have been many contributions, good contributions proposed, but the unique issue of sources of racism affects Indigenous peoples could read as follows. That is, that recognises with deep concern that historical injustices have denied Indigenous peoples control over their lands, territories and resources, and impeded Indigenous peoples' rights to self-determination and development, often resulting in subjugation, inequality and poverty, and that these injustices may continue to manifest inter alia as institutionalised racism within constitutional, legal or administrative frameworks of states. Secondly, Mr. Facilitator, on the provision of effective remedies, we might say that it urges progress in the adoption of fair, independent, impartial, open and transparent processes to promote, protect and uphold the rights of Indigenous peoples, and to recognise and adjudicate on claims by Indigenous peoples for restitution, reparation and other remedies arising from discrimination. States, where they have not already done so, should ensure objective mechanisms are in place to ensure treaties, agreements and other constructive arrangements concluded with Indigenous peoples are honoured and respected. Finally, Mr. Facilitator, in terms of strategies, we could say urges states in a spirit of partnership to operate in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples to identify and establish suitable measures to overcome the political, social, economic and cultural disadvantages faced by Indigenous peoples as a result of racism and historical injustices against them, and to assist states to tackle substantial obligations regarding Indigenous peoples arising from international and national commitments to human rights. States should ensure that Indigenous peoples are aware of their rights and freedoms. Mr. Facilitator, I'll just conclude by pointing out that the paragraphs I have suggested have been given to some of the delegations here, and that these capture, I think, most specifically the situation that Indigenous peoples face as peoples and having to deal with what are historical and continuing injustices. Thank you very much.
Thank the distinguished representative of FAIRA. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of International Committee for the Respect of Application of African Charter and the Rights of Peoples, CIRAC. You have the floor.
Monsieur le Président,
Facilitator, the International Committee for Respect of and Implementation of the African Charter of Human Rights and Peoples is following closely the work of this session of the PrepCom of the Durban Review Conference, would like to make some brief comments. The unprecedented rise in racism, its banalisation, persistence of racist attitude, behaviour and discourse, calling into question the great achievements of Durban, are serious reasons for holding this review conference. It's going to be an important milestone on the way to a rehumanised world. The review conference is not important just for the victims of racism, it's important for the whole of humanity. It's a sine qua non for true reconciliation among people on a global scale. That's why the issue of reparations in the DDPA should appear in its due place in the agenda of the PrepCom and the review conference itself in April 2009. Reparations due from Western nations who have inherited benefits from the transatlantic slave trade, the most heinous crime against humanity, is not only a moral imperative but also expression of the will and the determination to heal historic wounds which today make it impossible to achieve true reconciliation between Western nations who have inherited the benefits of the transatlantic slave trade and the black peoples of the whole world, both those of the continent and those of the diaspora. Sir, though colonialism, colonization and apartheid were condemned firmly in Durban in 2001, we are nonetheless witnessing the emergence of worrying initiatives which are presenting apologies of colonization and colonialism. I particularly refer to the law of 23 February 2005 adopted by the French Parliament, openly acknowledging positive aspects of colonization. This is a dangerous act, sir. It's directed at insulting peoples who are victims of this strategy and of nullifying the content of the DDPA. The final document of the review conference should firmly condemn these revisionist excesses and clearly recognise that colonialism and colonization are crimes against humanity. Colonization and apartheid are merely a continuation of the slave trade in another form. So the outcome document should underscore that the basis of colonialism and colonization were racism and racial discrimination. The chapters on the causes of racism, victims of racism, racial discrimination are therefore fundamental. Racism becoming commonplace, anti-black racism in particular, impunity for the perpetrators of racist acts are all issues of grave concern for our organisation and should be given particular attention at the review conference. So we draw attention of this PrepCom to the fate of African civil servants, black civil servants, who were called monkeys in an important UN system in Geneva 8 years after the World Conference on Racism. This sort of thing is quite unacceptable. The complete impunity enjoyed in South Africa by Dr. Wouter Basson, called Dr. Death, who was the author of crimes against blacks during the apartheid era, is notorious. And also the existence of human zoos in Germany shortly after Durban, where blacks were exposed to the sight of voyeurs. And during many and long years, someone was exposed as an animal in England and France, and the remains were restored to South Africa by France in complete anonymity. Thank you.
I thank you for that statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of African Commission on Health Promoters and Human Rights. You have the floor.
La Commission africaine des promoteurs de la santé des droits.
Thank you. The African Commission of Health and Human Rights Promoters, as well as its partners working in Africa and throughout the diaspora, would like to begin by expressing their support for the work being done at this session of the PrepCom for the Durban Review Conference. This is a crucial session in order to allow us to define and to adopt a bold agenda to guarantee effective implementation of the DDPA at the DRC. That programme remains the programme in which the hopes of the world are placed. The tragedy of the transatlantic slave trade, which ravaged the African continent from the 15th to the 19th centuries, is indeed the greatest tragedy ever to strike humanity throughout its history, the greatest in terms of its duration and its magnitude. It took place at a key moment in history, the first phase of globalization, when through violence and terror, the Black peoples were excluded from history because their humanity and their contribution to global development were denied in what took place. In saying that, you will have some idea of just how important our organisation and our partners believe the current work to be. Indeed, we believe it is beyond price. Colonisation in the African continent, colonialism and apartheid, which resulted in an extension of that slave trade, in fact, meant that whole civilizations were uprooted and the creative impetus of Black peoples was denied. We therefore believe that there is a need for us to enhance efforts made to fight discrimination in the world today in order to allow this very serious malfunctioning to be redressed. And we need to look at this carefully throughout the preparatory process. And I think with that in mind, we have to bear in mind particularly the importance of civil society and having appropriate involvement of civil society and its representatives. In fact, we have never seen that everyone was properly informed, and this meant that people were excluded from the Abuja conference, which is extremely important in terms of the ultimate outcome of the DRC itself. Allow me to conclude, Chairman, by drawing attention of members of this committee to one key point. This is a point that is frequently overlooked in the course of our work, and what I have in mind is the NGO Forum. In fact, organised in Durban in 2001, and contrary to what some people now allege, the NGO Forum, which was organised on the fringes of the conference as such, proved itself to be an area where people thought responsibly about issues involved in our work in this area. And we saw that civil society, working in perfect harmony with governments, can provide real solidarity and real support to our common endeavours.
I thank the distinguished representative of African Commission on Health Promoters and Human Rights. I now give the floor for a joint statement to the distinguished representative of Habitat International Coalition.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this opportunity. My intervention revolves around item number 1, section B, on victims. We have sadly observed that both the DDPA and the current draft outcome paper have recognized the Palestinian people as one of the groups of victims of racism and racial discrimination in paragraph 63 and 108 respectively, while having remained silent about how they have been victimized by the State of Israel. Specifically, in paragraphs 108 through 111 of the draft outcome paper, there highlights the manifestations of the conflict, such as the settlements, collective punishment, and self-determination, but not the root cause. Contrary to what has been brought up by some state representatives during negotiations, and in keeping with the spirit and the substance of the DDPA, we urge that the PrepCom to not only support paragraphs 108 through 111, but to also make the necessary revisions so as to reflect the true nature of the conflict. We strongly urge state representatives to clearly and definitively emphasize the core source of Israeli aggression towards the Palestinians. Specifically, we want to reaffirm that institutionalized discrimination on the grounds of nationality, ethnicity, race, and religion constitute a root cause and a consequence of the ongoing internal forcible displacement and dispossession of the Palestinian people. Further, it should also be highlighted that the principles of equality and the prohibition of discrimination are not guaranteed in Israel's basic law, human dignity and liberty, which serves as Israel's Bill of Rights. As a result, and in conjunction with Israel's self-identification as a Jewish and democratic state, the Palestinian citizens of Israel are afforded no constitutional protection against racial discrimination. By this, Israel is failing to comply with its obligations under international human rights law. Finally, it should also be noted that Israel unambiguously differentiates between nationality and citizenship, whereas in most nations they are one and the same. In Israel, the inherent racism within the state accords priority standing to nationals as opposed to citizens. As such, the status of Jewish nationality is accompanied with first-class rights and benefits, which are not guaranteed to non-Jews, i.e. Palestinians. Moreover, because Jewish nationality can never be accorded to Palestinians, they will forever remain second-class citizens of the state. This, of course, is evident in a variety of laws. We would like to end this statement by urging the distinguished representatives of this committee to not be sidetracked by grand statements of anti-Semitism or anti-Israel, for as we all know, Arabs and Jews are both Semitic populations, and the real issue at hand is the aggression and discrimination practiced by Israel towards the Palestinians. If we are to remain true to the original intentions of the WCAR and the spirit of CERD, then we must persevere in protecting the victims, even if at the expense of the state sensitivities. Thank you.
Thank you for that statement. I'm now giving the floor to the distinguished representative of Movement Against Racism and for Friendship Among Peoples. You have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Facilitateur.
Thank you, Facilitator. Sir, the process of monitoring review of the Durban documents cannot weaken the commitments made in 2001. It must lead states to reaffirm and strengthen, and if necessary, subscribe to new commitments without that affecting the spirit of the DDPA, in the interests, of course, of the victims. Victims who are really underrepresented in this room and who objectively have considerable difficulty in feeding into the work because they don't have the working document. So once again, an appeal that all new versions of documents may be made available to everybody on the internet immediately. So the compilation under section 4, which was submitted, contains many useful elements. We believe that the list is not exhaustive, and this could suggest that those who are not listed in the document could not or should not be considered as part of best practice. Among the elements listed in paragraph 10p, the second last one, and we know that order is important, it's recommended that national plans of action be adopted and measures of prevention under 21A. States are encouraged to develop their national plan of action against racism. Facilitator, we think it appropriate that in the framework of the review of the documents adopted at Durban, the issue of national action plans be given pride of place in terms of good practice or best practices, and that the PrepCom should require the publication of a compilation of national plans and have it recognized as an official conference document. We believe that under new initiatives, the review conference should decide to entrust to an intergovernmental working group or an ad hoc working group the burden of coming up with a model national plan of action, which each state may then adapt to its requirements and specific problems, and this should be done following extensive debate with all concerned. We'd also like to recommend that in paragraph 11 of section 4, definition not be limited or it be accompanied by inter alia in the practices which are contrary to the principles and purposes of the Charter, because experience shows that there are other less spectacular but equally violating of the Charter, and the Sahrawi and the indigenous peoples can bear witness to this. Finally, sir, we would like to suggest that in paragraph 151 of the compilation put forward under section 5, there be included the concept of increased financial and human resources for the anti-discrimination unit. Whatever the label, there's no point if the bottle is half empty. Thank you.
Thank you for that statement. I'm now giving the floor to the distinguished representative of Afro-Swedish National Association. Seems not in the room. So I give the next speaker on my list, the distinguished representative of Indian movement, Tupac Amaru. Seems he's also not in the room. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of National Coordinator for Human Rights.
Muy buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Distinguished representatives, I'm a member of the National Coordinator for Human Rights of Peru, and on their behalf I would like to draw attention to the issue of racial discrimination in the influence of multinational companies. Multinational companies are important to overall development of peoples. Unfortunately, in Latin America and Africa, militarization of indigenous lands and torture and arbitrary detention of social leaders working with multinationals, and particularly in the mining industry, are a common occurrence. So are environmental destruction, the violation of union rights and other human rights. Most of the time, these violations of human rights remain unpunished. Such violations of rights are undoubtedly examples of racial discrimination because their impact is different on historically vulnerable groups like indigenous peoples and people of African descent. The DDPA refers to this in general terms in paragraphs 215. However, we find that to date very little or nothing has been done in this area, and that is why we would like to call on member states to fortify measures related to the private sector under the DDPA, including in the review document, following recommendations to countries in which multinationals have their headquarters. First of all, to establish mechanisms to give access to justice for the victims of racial discrimination in the countries in which those multinationals have their headquarters, and also to ensure that multinationals respect human rights in third countries, and not by actions in multinationals that violate human rights in third countries, to provide information systems publicly on the conduct of multinationals in third countries and ensure that multinationals in third countries use the best possible technology in order to safeguard the environment, as per paragraph 111C of the DDPA. And finally, we would request countries in which multinationals operate that they strengthen the monitoring mechanisms provided for in Durban by developing adequate legal instruments to combat racial discrimination in the area of their influence, and also providing access to justice through relevant mechanisms. It's only in this way that we can say that the scourge of colonialism will have been eradicated from our planet.
Thank you for that statement. I'm now giving the floor to the distinguished representative of Galet's Black Women Institute. Yes, you have the floor, ma'am.
Senhoras e senhores.
Ladies and gentlemen, we representatives of civil society in different continents and countries in the world, and in Latin America and Brazil, are the main reason and why you should do your work better. The third Durban conference was and still is a great event promoting all our aspirations towards an elimination of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related forms of intolerance. We should all, I think, congratulate ourselves on that. Now, after 7 years of reaching the consensus enshrined in the DDPA, we recognize that important achievements have been made, but measures have not yet been sufficient to provide reparation for the ravages of racism, racial discrimination and xenophobia which affects our people, such as child mortality, deaths of women and girls from violence, identity-aggravated discrimination, gender discrimination, and others. There are still changes happening in political and economic areas in the world which lead us to doubt whether solutions will be found to these problems without strong action from all of you. We hope that the achievements be promoted and implemented, and that all countries, beginning with this consensus, go further in affirming those rights. And we also urge that no NGO seeking accreditation to cooperate in this process not be excluded, as this would be discrimination. And we are very glad that the ABGTL was eventually accredited. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative for that statement. Now I give the floor for a joint statement. The distinguished representative from Red de Mojares.
No, it's European network, because I think, no? Okay.
Yes, you have the floor, sir.
No, espérate. Gracias.
Thank you. Facilitator. In order to improve mechanisms used to promote the fight against racism, racial discrimination, we think that new communication technologies should be used. Audiovisuals are a fundamental tool and should be part of the agenda of the next review conference, which will be held here in April 2009. Media and communication products are decisive in daily life. If something is not present as an image or a voice, they don't exist. They're an important part of social conscience, both in terms of historical thought and in being the birthplace of new paradigms. We need to ask states to create intellectual support and provide resources to audiovisual products relating to the African population and people of African descent in order to provide an image of their cultural heritage and current civilization. Communication using unequivocal symbols on social relations uses valuing language. Education in the mass media should be therefore part of our cultural codes and patterns. There's a dual impact of the media message, both by excluding and by recreating stereotypes on, for example, people of African descent, affecting their self-esteem, harming young people. Discriminatory, racist messages fashion the mentality both of the dominant culture and the rest of society, which means that just not mentioning the subject is establishing cultural patterns which will be continually reproduced, and exclusion will become perpetual. So any program, any starting point which wants to achieve ethnic and racial equity must use audiovisual products as an indispensable tool to promote any change in social mentality. Finally, the most common threat, whatever the theater of racism, is negation. The negation of racism is our daily bread, and that's where audiovisual products can develop inclusive discourse. So culture as an intellectual tool par excellence, and the media in particular, can do that work. So we propose that a media network be set up dealing with the issue of people of African descent, with the participation of civil society and UN agencies in order to provide alternative messages which can have an impact on the development of a racially inclusive discourse. A new image will help to deconstruct historical racist stereotypes which prevent progress towards equity and the creation of societies with more participation, more justice, and in an enabling, peaceful environment. Thank you.
I thank you for that statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of European Network Against Racism.
Thank you very much, Mr. Facilitator, for this opportunity. We have barely 6 months to the Durban Review Conference, and yet there are no concrete commitments concerning how the Durban process intends to support and facilitate a meaningful participation of the civil society, including an NGO forum. The DDPA, which is the basis for these preparatory committee meetings and whose provisions are up for review in April of 2009, unequivocally recognizes and acknowledges the important roles and contributions that the civil society makes and is making towards realizing the objectives of the DDPA, namely creating a world free of all forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. But you will agree with me, I hope, that it is not enough to make statements of intent, no matter how promising. Our question, and this is a question that NGOs and the civil society at large are most eager for a clear and direct answer, is what logistic support can be provided to facilitate a meaningful participation of the civil society, including an NGO forum at the Durban Review Conference in April of 2009. We would like to have concrete information on allocations from the UN regular budget to support the participation of the civil society, including NGOs from all regions at the Durban Review Conference. This is important because it is the one way to ensure that the voices of the victims are heard. We would also like to know what additional voluntary support is available from countries that traditionally have supported civil society participation, including NGO participation at UN conferences. We conclude with the reminder that the world community has no choice but to make the Durban Review Conference a success. Thank you, Mr. Facilitator.
I thank you for that statement. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of International Campaign for Tibet.
Thank you, Mr. Facilitator. International Campaign for Tibet welcomes this opportunity to address the second platform. Since this is the first time after the World Conference that we speak before you, permit us to report that since 2002, we engaged in an outreach program towards the Chinese community in order to bridge the information gap and to strengthen the human relationship between the two communities. Our latest initiative in this respect was the launch of a new website in Chinese to provide Tibetans and Chinese with a forum to exchange views in a spirit of frankness and respect. With respect to the two draft sections under discussion, we believe many important languages have been proposed. However, we are concerned on the lack of emphasis on the promotion of human values and the sense of oneness within the humanity, which serve to promote peace among different communities within one nation and within one world. In other words, one of the best tools for prevention is the promotion of secular ethics, whereby we human beings first learn to shoulder our universal responsibility in the spirit of brotherhood and sisterhood, as the Dalai Lama advocates in his public talks. We welcome the attention given to interfaith dialogue and believe that the review conference should get a fuller sense of the nature of interfaith dialogues, which is taking all over the world today. The compilation of a data by High Commissioner's Office on this important issue should be the desirable follow-up implementation program of the review conference. Mr. Facilitator, while there is no denying that foreign occupation or alien domination and contemporary forms of colonialism affects the lives of millions in this world today, it is imperative for the review conference outcome document to pay equal attention to issues like population transfer or the implementation of settlers. This is vital because of the threats deriving from such situations to the very survival of a people when confronted by state-sponsored policies to realize a demographic change of the indigenous homeland. Such practices should be recognized as a form of cultural genocide, we believe. In conclusion, on the issue of incitement of hatred, the review conference must take stock of situations like when, for example, an undisputed spiritual leader of a people is defamed by a government as, I quote, a devil with a human face but with a heart of a beast. Or when the Tibetan people are told, I quote, the Communist Party is like parents to the Tibetan people and are always considerate about the children's need. The party is the real Buddha for the Tibetans. I thank you for giving me the floor.
I thank you for that statement. Now, we have 9 more NGOs to speak, but unfortunately, I'm not in the position to give them floor. We wish them to take the floor, but time doesn't permit. I think the Secretariat has to make some announcement, and we have to conclude, adjourn the meeting because in terms of time. So, I now wish to give the floor to the Secretariat to make those announcements on of the program of work for tomorrow. Yes, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Facilitator. Pursuant to the timetable adopted by the PrepCom, only items 7 and 8 were scheduled for consideration tomorrow on Friday, the 17th of October. However, the Bureau of the PrepCom will be meeting tomorrow from 8 to 10 o'clock, and the Bureau will consider how to organize its work, the work of the PrepCom tomorrow, in order to accommodate all pending issues or unfinished matters, including the completion of today's observer segment. Therefore, you are invited to be here tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Thank you.
I thank the Secretariat for that announcement. Excellencies, dear colleagues, I thank you all, including observers, for your contributions to the preparatory process of the Durban Review Conference. I wish you a very good evening, and the meeting is adjourned.